The Justice Department under the Trump administration has opened only one federal investigation into a police department, and it was into an issue in the narcotics unit in Springfield, Massachusetts. The Boston Globe reports that under President Obama, the DOJ opened over 24 investigations into systemic abuses by police departments in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, and New Orleans. Karol Mason is the president of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She also served in the Obama administration's Justice Department, and she joins me now from New York City. Karol, thanks very much for being with us. When the DOJ makes suggestions to police departments, how do those suggestions get implemented?
Thank you very much for having me here and giving me an opportunity to talk with you about the work we do at John Jay and my prior experience at the Department of Justice. When I was at the Department of Justice, I ran the Office for Justice Programs, which partnered with the Civil Rights Division. So when there were recommendations that the departments needed to follow, often the Office for Justice Programs would provide the training and technical assistance that was often required to help them comply with the requirements of the consent decrees.
In a letter to the John Jay community, you wrote that your job there is to, quote, equip the next generation of officers with the tools to partner with the communities they serve to understand the painful legacies of how, under the color of law, many of these communities were harmed and not protected by those sworn to protect them. How might recent events impact the way John Jay educates future officers?
Well, one of the things that we want to do is pull together a group of our current students who are going into policing, along with some of our alumni who are in uniform and out in policing now, and some of the law enforcement leaders, to think about what it is we ought to make sure that we're equipping our students to do. So when you see what happened in Minneapolis, I want our officers to be the officers who would have said, stop, this isn't right. They would have intervened and said, stop doing what you're doing to George Floyd. And that's the kind of officer that I want to educate in coming out of John Jay and filling our law enforcement agencies across this country.
You mentioned you served in the Obama Justice Department. His administration pushed to limit police departments from acquiring military-grade equipment and for the widespread use of body cameras. How would you rate the success of those efforts?
It's interesting you ask those two questions because I led both of those efforts for the department when I was there. So one of the things we learned after Ferguson is we wanted people to understand that police are there to serve their communities, not to be an army infiltrating a community. And most law enforcement agencies want to be that partner. And so we wanted to equip them to be able to be those partners. We thought that body-worn cameras would be beneficial for both the officers and for the community because there would be a record of every encounter with law enforcement agencies. And they both welcomed it because it was an opportunity also for police departments to use those recordings, because that's the key thing, is we have this information and they have to use it. So we wanted them to use it as a training tool as well so that the department leadership could look at what they see on those tapes and say, this is a learning opportunity. Here's how you could have done this differently. This was a great way to do this and handle this encounter. But it's designed to hopefully build trust between the officers and the community and the officers with their leadership as well.
Well, at this moment in time, as you know, community activists, senators are now talking about police reform, and we have heard calls certainly for these kinds of changes before. But do you believe that this time is different somehow?
I hope so. I know that as the president of John Jay College, which sends out more students into law enforcement than I think any other school in the country, we are committed to making sure that our law enforcement officers represent the best of policing and that they know how to partner with their communities. And one of the advantages we have at John Jay is our students who are going to law enforcement are sitting in class alongside the same students who may protest them later. And so they're learning from each other, supporting each other. And I hope that our officers coming out of John Jay have the networks and resources so they can partner with communities if they've got questions to know how to reach out to the community and say, what is it you need from us? How can we help you? Because the ultimate goal is to create safe communities. And I think that's one of the things I hope we discuss in this conversation is what is the role of policing in our country? And I think the role of policing is to be able to be supportive of communities.
And I want to ask you a little bit more about that. I mean, given the fact that there is such a lack of trust right now at a granular level, how can police work to restore trust between officers and communities that they're hired to serve?
So one of the things that when I was at the Department of Justice, we created the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. And John Jay happened to be the recipient of that grant award to work with police departments to figure out how to do that, to restore that trust. And what we use is research, the principles of procedural justice, learning about implicit bias and dealing with racial reconciliation, so that we can go in and really train not just the officers, but train them alongside their community members to help restore and strengthen that trust with each other.
You mentioned implicit bias. I just want to ask, is there evidence, or is it still unclear, whether or not implicit bias training actually works?
Well, as an institution that's done a lot of research, our professor, Phil Goff, has been on a lot of news shows talking about that. I believe there is some demonstrable evidence that understanding and recognizing, we all have implicit biases. And the question is, how do you make sure that you're aware of them? And then and build systems around what might be a natural bias to make sure that the system works as equitably and fairly as we all want it to.
Well, today, House Republicans called Pastor Darrell Scott as one of their witnesses at a hearing on police brutality. He said this, quote, "Defunding of police departments in America has already happened, and it has proven to be an epic fail." What are your thoughts on these calls to defund the police? Do you see any merit in that approach?
Well, I'd actually use different words. I think the question is, how do we allocate resources? And I think that we've had police leadership for years saying that we need to invest more in social services, invest more in mental health, because we're asking that's why I said we need to examine what's the role of policing. We're asking our police system, our criminal justice system, to be the safety net for other failures in our system. So we need to be investing in education. We need to be investing in mental health, in health generally, in creation of jobs. And so I think the question is communities need to be looking at how do we create safer communities, and how do we invest where the investments need to be, so that we don't have people winding up in our criminal justice system because other parts of the system have failed them.
All right, Karol Mason. Karol, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me.